ekonomik krizinin yani Atlantik Euro bölgemi çözmeye çalışarak. Stephen Walt'tan başlıyoruz.
Thank you. I think to answer the question, I think the Arab Spring did not begin as a consequence of what was happening in Europe, although I believe the financial crisis of 2007-2008 may have contributed. But I think in the case of the Arab Spring, many people understood that some of these societies were highly unequal, where in particular in Egypt, political institutions had been frozen for many years, had not been responsive to what public sentiment, what the people wanted, and therefore the situation was ripe for a political upheaval. What caused it to happen, of course, we all know, begins with events in Tunisia, and what I think was the most surprising feature of the Arab Spring was not that it happened, because many people thought something like this would happen eventually, but rather how quickly it spread from Tunisia to Egypt, to Bahrain, to Libya, to I think in other places like Yemen as well, and now of course to Syria. And I think many people were surprised, including myself, by the degree to which a small event in one country gradually caught on in so many other places. I think that had less to do with the financial crisis than it had to do with both the political stagnation that had taken place in those societies, but also by the ability of information to spread from one country to another, for people in Egypt to see what was happening in Tunisia, for people in Bahrain or Syria to see what had happened in these other societies. And that was, I think, primarily a consequence of satellite television, Al Jazeera and other services, and not so much what you often read about, Twitter and the Internet and things like that. I would say just one other thing about it, which is I think it is still very early in this entire process of political development. If you think back to other revolutions that have occurred in the world, the French Revolution begins in 1789 and it goes through many different phases before the arrival of Napoleon 10 years later. It's 10 years before the French Revolution really ends up with Napoleon. Similarly, the Russian Revolution begins in 1917, but Bolshevik control of Russia is not completed for many years after that. And I think you could say much the same thing about the American Revolution, which takes many years before it takes its final form, and even the Iranian Revolution was not what it currently is today within a few months. So I believe it will actually be a number of years before we know the full extent of where the Arab Spring, so to speak, is leading us.
Tabii ben Arap Baharı'ndan yeni dünya düzenine geçişi başlatmış oldum ama burada bağlayıcı da olmak istemiyorum. Sizin düşüncenizi alayım. Arap Baharı'ndan bağımsız olarak hangi dinamikler bizi yeni dünya düzeninin oluşmasına da ya da yeni dünya düzenini tartışmamıza yol açıyor? Sadece Arap Baharı mıdır? Yoksa gerçekten onun dışında demin sözünü ettiğimiz evet Arap Baharı ile global kriz arasında bir bağ kurmadınız ama global krizin sonrasında dünya yeniden nasıl şekillenecek? İşte bridge ülkeleri dediğimiz ülkeler ve bu ülkelerin ekonomik güçlerinin artması, henüz siyasi olarak bir güç haline gelmeseler bile bu ekonomik gücün, sahip oldukları ekonomik gücün önümüzdeki dönemde bir siyasi güce dönüşüp dönüşmeyeceği, dolayısıyla dünyanın hani 90'larda tek kutuplu hale dönüşen dünyanın nereye doğru evrildiği ya da savrulduğunu görebiliriz bu krizin sonrasında.
All political power, I believe, ultimately comes out of economic power. For example, you can't have a strong military if you don't have a strong economy. And the emergence in places like Brazil and Turkey and India and China of stronger economies will give these countries more influence in the future than they have had in the past. In that sense, yes, things are changing. But you don't want to exaggerate how great those changes are either. You don't want to exaggerate the degree of political influence that these countries will have in the short term. For example, Brazil, which is in some sense the economically largest of these newly developing countries apart from China, Brazil's economy is still only 1/6 as large as the economy of the United States. The United States is still going to be the world's most powerful country for many years, if not decades, to come. Its position in the world is changing in some important ways, I think in part as a result of the financial crisis and the result of the emergence of these new power centers, but it is not a complete overturning of the global balance of power. The United States is still going to be involved in many places, and I would argue that most of the BRICS, including China, are not going to be true global powers for another 10 or 20 years. Rather, these are countries that are primarily going to be influential within their particular region. So Brazil will have lots of influence in Latin America. Turkey will have lots of influence in the Middle East, possibly Central Asia. China will have lots of influence in East Asia. But the United States is likely to be still the only truly global power able to act in almost any part of the world. The big change for the United States as a result of some of our economic problems and the mistakes we have made in places like Iraq and Afghanistan is that we are going to have to make choices in the future. We are not going to be able to interfere in every part of the world all the time. We are only going to be able to interfere in some parts of the world some of the time. I'm not sure that that's not a good thing, actually, both for us and also for the rest of the world.
Şimdi daha çok Türkiye'nin dışındaki ülkelerin, dolayısıyla dünyanın büyük güçlerinin yeni dünya düzenindeki rollerini ve yeni gelişen süreci, Arap Baharı'nı konuştuk. Ama ben diğer konuşmacılarımıza da sormak istiyorum. Nasıl göründüğünü Türkiye'nin dışarıdan, çünkü burada hani izleyicilerimizin büyük bölümünün Türkiye'den olduğu düşünülürse, Türkiye'nin yeni dünya düzenindeki rolünü siz nasıl görüyorsunuz? Son zamanlardaki Türkiye'nin özellikle Orta Doğu'ya yönelik diplomatik ataklarını da düşündüğünüzde.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to add a couple of points to what
Sure.
Professor Walt has said first, and I agree very much with what he said. So this is a matter of stress. One of the things that has happened is the emergence of a more open international economy, and I think that has made a colossal difference.
Microphone is off, so you have to. Yeah.
Okay? Is that it?
There's no red line. Okay, yes. Now it's on.
Well, thank you. I don't know whether I should repeat everything I said, but just to say that I agree very much with what Professor Walt has pointed out, and I wanted to add a couple of points, or stress a couple of points. Namely, that changes in thinking about economics, in particular the appearance of what has been called neoliberal economics, has made a very big difference. I'll say a little about not always to the good, but there is certainly one very, very positive element, that it has led to new thinking about the relationship between particular national economies and the global economy. And this new thinking has been pretty much universal. And I think that it has played a part in the opening up of China, India, indeed generally, the BRIC countries. That the role of governments has moved back somewhat and allowed the role of what President George W. Bush used to say the French lacked, namely entrepreneurs to become much more pressing. And I think that one has to say that that new economic ideology, that change in thinking about the prospects of national enclosed economies has made a very, very big difference. But of course, like so many aspects of the development of international order, it isn't quite as simple as that. Because that new way of thinking about economics has also led to a much increased differentiation between the wealth of the rich and the wealth of the poor. So that all over the world, I think, including Western Europe, including Britain, you find that people who feel to some degree left out of the new prosperity are beginning to complain. And there's built up a degree of political pressure about this. Now, I think that point should not be ignored, even with regard to the Arab Spring, that there has been the observation that in so many of the countries of North Africa, that there have been rich elites and populations that have not been able to gain advantage from the new prosperity. And that has led in, or has been harnessed by, feelings about democracy, the need for more democracy. It's a potent mixture of elements. And of course, another development in recent years of absolutely vital importance, called the CNN effect, is the fact that Facebook and other social media have allowed people to communicate with each other, to transmit views about what is possible, and particularly to organize very quickly on the ground. I myself am the possessor of a BlackBerry. I'm told that the BlackBerry has played a very important part in organizing protests in a number of the North African states. In addition to that, of course, another part of the mixture is the kinds of pressure going on from agencies around the North African countries. From the EU, the drive towards emulation of what has been going on in the EU. And for a number of countries, the pressures deriving from what has been called conditionality. In other words, the EU will only lend or help if there is movement towards a degree of democratization. The presence of the EU on the northern side of the Mediterranean, I think, has also been a factor. And finally, there is the, last but not least, the pressure from the British Commonwealth that has been very active in processes of democratization around Africa, slowly encroaching upon the countries of the Mediterranean coast. And, of course, we've heard earlier about the West African countries that have prospered increasingly and become more open and more democratic. Your point about Turkey, my view is that it is quite correct for Turkey to carry on, to continue with efforts to become a more important regional power. Internal changes within Turkey are very helpful. This is an agenda that was initially pushed by the EU. It need not have been pushed by the EU. It should have been there anyway. It should continue anyway. We have to see, of course, to wait and see what happens with Turkey's attempts to join the EU. As yet, there are difficulties, as we all know. We needn't rehearse those. But at least one would have to say that Turkey will gain nothing but benefit if the economy continues to improve, if internal arrangements continue to improve, and if Turkey begins to develop links with other countries in the Turkish region. One thinks in some ways, I suppose, of, well, there are many examples of the way in which the EU has seen advantage in accepting a member because of that country's links with other parts of the world. One thinks of Spain and the links with the Middle East. So I'm sorry, I've gone rather at length about adding to what Professor Walt has said, but I think I've also given some answer to your question about the role of Turkey.
Peki. Çok teşekkür ediyorum. Sayın Levy'ye geçmeden önce ben aynı soruyu Sayın Walt'a, Profesör Walt'a tekrar sormak istiyorum. Türkiye ile ilgili onun da görüşünü almak istiyorum. Şimdi Sayın Taylor'ın söylediği Türkiye'nin Avrupa Birliği'ne girmesi vesaire, bölgesel güç olması. Şunu öğrenmek istiyorum çünkü Türkiye'de herkes bunu merak ediyor. Türkiye çok aktif bir rol oynuyor. Özellikle Arap Baharı'ndan sonra Orta Doğu'da. Türkiye'nin bu bölgesel güç olmasının da ötesinde bu yeni dünya düzeninde güç odaklarından biri haline dönüşebileceği varsayımlarını en azından konuşturuyor, düşündürüyor. Dışarıdan nasıl görünüyor? Sizin kişisel görüşünüz olarak değil yalnızca. Batı dünyası bu anlamda Türkiye'yi bu küresel dünyanın, yeni dünya düzeninin güç dengeleri içerisinde bir rakip olarak mı görüyor, bir ortak olarak mı görüyor?
I think the outside world primarily sees Turkey as a partner, not as a rival, and as an ally that can be very valuable in some contexts, particularly contexts to take the American case where it is sometimes difficult for the United States to operate. One of the reasons I wanted to come here and have now been here several times is because I've been interested in the changes that have been taking place in Turkey and in particular how that has affected Turkish diplomacy, Turkish foreign policy. And I think it's been a fascinating study for several reasons. I thought a few years ago, I think like many of you probably did, that the foreign policy that was known as sort of zero problems, of attempting to solve as many diplomatic issues with Turkey's neighbors and to position Turkey in a place where Turkey had good relations with almost all the countries in the region. I thought that was a really brilliant idea. I thought that was exactly the right way for Turkey to proceed because Turkey would find itself in a position where other countries would want to come to Ankara to help address concerns that they had in the region. That Turkey would be in a very favorable position if it had good relations with almost everyone in its neighborhood. But, as I think we have all discovered, that's easy to conceive and it's easy to start, but it's hard to make it work perfectly. And we've seen that Turkey's zero problems diplomacy has hit some bumps in the last few years. Problems, as you all know, with Israel, problems especially with Syria now, and Turkey is discovering, it seems to me, the same things that the United States and other powerful countries have discovered, is that you can start with a vision, you can start with a plan, you can start with a set of objectives, but actually getting to those objectives is often much more difficult than you initially think, because other countries sometimes do things that you would rather they didn't do. Sometimes other countries don't listen to you when you offer them what you think is good advice. Sometimes the advice is good, but others choose not to follow it. And I think that Turkey is discovering that lesson as well. In terms of how Turkey looks to the United States, I think, or to others, I think people are very impressed by many of the internal reforms within Turkey, the reforms to the criminal justice system, economic reforms that have generated economic growth for Turkey, the expansion of education. All of that looks quite positive. And I think in general, we see Turkey playing a very constructive role in the world. I think there are also features in Turkey's development that are of concern to others, in particular issues of press freedom and freedom of speech and things like that, which continues to be an issue, and obviously the long-standing issue of treatment of minorities. And so therefore, I think Turkey's friends outside Turkey are hoping that those issues get resolved in a positive way, because in a sense we would like as few points of disagreement as possible going forward. I guess the last point I would make about Turkey's role is that I think the United States and Turkey agree on maybe 75% of world issues. And on many of those issues, the United States and Turkey can work together to try and address them. There are also going to be some issues about which we're going to disagree. That's natural. That happens between all countries, even countries that are good friends. And it will therefore be important for the United States as well as for Turkey to understand that we can be friends without agreeing on every single issue. And again, that may be something where that requires a bit more adjustment on my country's part than it does on Turkey's part, because I think the United States is accustomed to having others do pretty much what we want them to. And one of the things we have to get used to is the fact that for a democratic country like Turkey, it's going to pursue its interests. Most of the time, those interests will be similar to ours, and when they differ, we're going to simply have to agree to disagree.
Tekrar Türkiye meselesine geleceğim. Sanıyorum burada bulunan izleyicilerimizin de bu konuda sizlere yönelteceği sorular da olacaktır. Sayın Levy'ye, İsrailli meslektaşımıza geçerken hani haksızlık etmek istiyorum. Konuyu sadece Orta Doğu ve Arap Baharı'na sıkıştırmak istemiyorum. Kuşkusuz bütün küresel anlamda yeni dünya düzeniyle ilgili sizin de görüşlerinizi öğrenmek isteriz ama Arap Baharı'ndan başlamak istiyorum. İsrail'den nasıl göründüğüne dair. İsrail bugüne kadar hani bölgedeki politikalarında Arap dünyasıyla temelinde Filistin sorunu olan bir çatışma ikliminde yaşadı. Dolayısıyla sanki bu çatışma iklimi İsrail'in bu anlamda kendi tutumunu, kendi pozisyonunu, kendi çıkarlarını korumak açısından daha işe yarayan bir iklim gibi geldi. Şimdi demokratik bir Arap toplumu İsrail açısından sorunun çözümünde daha tercih edilebilir bir süreç midir? Yoksa çatışma mı besler İsrail'in bölgedeki politikalarını?
First of all, one should pay attention to the fact that among the cruel, undemocratic regimes in the Middle East, there's one which is quite hidden, and this is the Israeli occupation in the Palestinian territories. It's not less brutal and not less illegal than the old Arab regimes. And somehow, when we talk about the Arab Spring, it must include the end of the occupation in the Palestinian territories. And when people talk about Israel as a democracy, and Israel is a democracy for its Jewish citizens, one should remember that as long as in the backyard of Israel, this reality goes on for 45 years now, no Arab Spring will be achieved and no democracy will be achieved to the entire Middle East. Because the Israeli occupation, which is now being forgotten, even if in this conference we hardly deal with it, for the benefit of Israel and for the benefit of the Israeli occupation, the Israeli occupation is not maybe the main issue, main global issue, but it is one that feeds so many emotions in the region and elsewhere. And any progress in the Middle East which will ignore the fact that the Israeli occupation continues will miss an historical moment and will miss an historical development. Now, when we speak about global changes, and when we speak about the United States losing part of its power or not, this is still to be proven. One should also remember the role of the United States in backing, encouraging, supplying, and strengthening the Israeli occupation. Without the United States, this occupation would never last for 45 years. So maybe we are facing now a new era in which the United States will be less influential, and then Israel will have to face a new world in which the automatic blind support of the United States will decrease. And we know the attitude of the rest of the world. I mean, still 5 million Jews in Israel believe that 7 billion people of the world are wrong and the Israeli occupation is necessary. But there is still the world, and it's not only about 5 million Jews in Israel. So those changes in the status of the United States might be very promising for the region in terms of the end of this automatic blind support in the Israeli occupation. Getting back to your country, Turkey, I think Turkey should have been and is for certain people a model which stands against all those prejudiced and racist, many times racist attitudes claiming that Islam and democracy cannot go together, claiming that Muslims and democratic regimes will never work. Turkey is the example that Islam can go together with democracy, problematic democracy, a democracy that should be proven, no doubt about it. It can even go with prosperity. And this Turkey, which should have played a main role in the Middle East, as the only regional superpower who has good contacts both with the Arab world and Israel who had almost no choice but to do anything possible to keep the good relations with Turkey, almost the only state in the region who really accepts Israel in the region. So one would expect Israel to do anything possible to keep this relationship. One would expect Israel to do anything possible to be accepted in the Middle East. But unfortunately, my country is doing anything possible not to be accepted in the Middle East for so many years. And I can't find the logic of losing such a strategic ally like Turkey, whose power is just growing, whose influence is just growing, maybe also the last outpost against Iran in the Middle East, for sure a very potential, very good go-between between the Arab world and Israel. In my view, Turkey could play an enormous role, maybe even bigger than the United States right now, especially vis-à-vis the American passiveness toward the Middle East. And then Israel came, so unfortunately, and said, no, if we have one friend in the Middle East, let's do anything possible to lose him as well. And we know the whole history of the deterioration in the relations between Israel and Turkey, which for people like me is extremely regrettable, extremely regrettable. I can't tell you how sorry I am that Israel is losing Turkey. I think that Israel needs Turkey much more than Turkey needs Israel. So if to sum up, the Arab Spring was perceived in Israel, obviously, as a big danger. For Israel, the old regimes were very comfortable. Who was better than Hosni Mubarak for Israel to keep the peace, to keep the economical relations? Even Bashar al-Assad was quite reasonable for Israel. We have a peaceful border, things are quite peaceful, even if there is no real peace. But it's time for Israel to realize that if Israel wants to survive, wants to be accepted in the Middle East, it's not enough to have good relations with some tyrannies and some dictatorships. They, the Arab peoples, not only to the Arab dictators. And therefore, Israel should have been extremely happy and have a lot of hope in this Arab Spring, especially if it will succeed, because democracy in the Middle East will mean also finally peace with Israel. Democracy in the Middle East will also force Israel to put an end to the occupation, because the support of the world will go with democratic regimes in the Middle East, maybe on the account of the Israeli occupation, the support on the Israeli occupation. But in Israel, there was immediate wave of demonization of the Arab Spring, immediately a brainwash of spreading fears, the Muslim Brotherhood, they're going to take over, they will cancel the peace with Egypt, they will attack Israel, they will support Iran, all the possible fears, as usual in my country. But I think this is also wrong for people like me. The Arab Spring is a big hope for my country, not only for the region. The fact that the United States will not be the only actor around is also a source of hope for me, because unfortunately the United States failed dramatically in bringing peace in the Middle East and bringing an end to the Israeli occupation. So I think one should cross fingers for the Arab Spring to succeed. Nobody can expect it to be an instant revolution of 1-2 years. There will be all kinds of phases and all kinds of developments. It's not one entity, the Arab world, and it's not one entity, the Arab Spring. It can succeed in one way, in one country, and fail in another one, as we can see it now. It can go to one direction in one country and go to a different direction in another country. But by and large, democracy in the Middle East is also a promise for a more just Middle East, and a more just Middle East must include the end of the Israeli occupation.
Evet, İsrail açısından, İsrail'in Arap Baharı'na bakış açısından son derece önemli bir tespitte bulundunuz. Ben çatışma ikliminden söz ettim, onun İsrail için daha uygun olup olmadığından, ama siz daha esaslı bir mesele ortaya koydunuz. İsrail diktatörlerle, Arap dünyasındaki diktatörlerle iş görmeyi, birlikte adı barış olan ama gerçek barış olmayan bir sürecin üstünde oturmayı tercih ediyordu. Şimdi dolayısıyla endişe ettiğini söylediniz. Biraz geçmişteki Soğuk Savaş dönemindeki nükleer dehşet dengesine benziyor bu geçmişteki Arap diktatörlerinin ve İsrail yönetiminin sözde barış süreci. Oysa şimdi Arap Baharı ile birlikte İsrail'in de gerçek barışı yakalayabileceğini, onun için bu süreci desteklemesi gerektiğini söylüyorsunuz. Tabii Sayın Levy meslektaşımız İsrail resmi görüşünden çok farklı bakıyor, bunu biliyoruz. Burada konuşmasının daha başlangıcında İsrail işgalini dile getirmesi son derece anlamlı. Benim için de şaşırtıcı değil. Daha önce yazdığı bir yazıda İsrail'in bakışı için Suriye'de olup bitenlere bakış açısından şöyle tespiti var. Biz diyor kendimiz için bir dünya icat ettik. Golan'da bizim sınırımızdakiler isyancı ama Suriye şehirlerindekiler protestocu gibi bir yaklaşım. Dolayısıyla iki çelişkili bir yaklaşımdan söz ettiniz. Şimdi Türkiye'ye bakış açısından Sayın Levy belki bunu daha iyi bilebilir. Çünkü özellikle Sayın Taylor'ın konuşmasında hani biz buna CNN devrimi veya işte devam ettirirsek sosyal medya devrimi diyoruz demişti. Türkiye'de biz buna bir şey daha ekliyoruz. Dizi etkisi. Biliyorsunuz, siz daha iyi bilebilirsiniz bölgede olduğunuz için, Türk dizileri özellikle Arap dünyasında çok fazla yayınlanıyor, çok büyük ilgi görüyor. Bunun Arap dünyasındaki açılımlar açısından, dünyaya bakış açısından onların hani Türkiye'yi bakarak yani yeni bir dünya modeli görüyor gibi olmaları birçok yerde konuşuluyor, tartışılıyor. İsrail'de var mı Türk dizileri ve o diziler Türk-İsrail ilişkilerindeki yaklaşıma toplumsal tabanda elbette kastediyorum, olumlu bir etkide bulunuyor mu?
We have too many TV series and too much reality on our TV and too little discussion with the real reality. We use the term Turkish film to describe a very dramatic relationship which always ends up with tears and always is stronger and bigger than life. But I'm very regretting also that the tides, if you refer to this, the tides between the two peoples, the Turkish people and the Israeli people, are now also deteriorating. It's not only about Israel and Turkey from the political level or the politicians. It's also those close ties of tourism, of visits, of commerce, of really finding one neighbor around who is ready to accept us. And I think that for Israelis, not only for Israeli politicians, for Israelis, Turkey could be also a model on the very popular level. So many Israelis enjoyed so much Turkey in the past. And you know, now if an Israeli goes to Turkey, so many people ask me, aren't you afraid to go to Istanbul? Because the brainwash is so deep. It is regrettable, and maybe, you know, maybe we should get back to a Turkish film and put an end to this stupid dispute with some tears and some happiness and some love affair between the two peoples.
Yok, bizim son zamanlardaki diziler sizin o eski kastettiğiniz Türk filmlerinden farklı. Gözyaşı ve melodramdan ibaret değil. Onun için etkisi daha da farklı olabilir. Tavsiye ederiz televizyon dünyasından biri olarak. Dizi ihracatı en azından hayat tarzı ihraç etmese bile ciddi bir döviz getirisine gerçekten de kaynak olabiliyor. Şimdi sorular var galiba ama bir şeyi sormadan edemeyeceğim. Şimdi siz İsrail yönetiminin bu sahte ya da sözde barış sürecini diktatörlerle götürmeyi tercih ettiğini söylediniz. Sormadan edemeyeceğim dediğim hem Sayın Walt ya da Sayın Taylor cevap verebilir. Şimdi Türkiye'de övgüyle söz ettiğiniz bir demokratikleşme süreci var. Bu süreç içerisinde darbelerle yüzleşme sürecini de bu dönemde yaşıyor Türkiye. Darbelerle hesaplaşma, yüzleşme, işte geçmişe bakarak öz eleştiri yapma. Tam da bu noktada acaba Batı dünyasının ve özellikle Amerika Birleşik Devletleri'nin de Türkiye'de geçmişte olup biten darbelerle ilgili olarak bundan sonraki ilişkilerin daha iyi olması açısından en azından bir hesaplaşma, biz öz eleştiri, biz yüzleşme sürecine gitmesi gerekmiyor mu? Çünkü geçmişte de Amerikan yönetimleri, bugün farklı olabilir ama işte Soğuk Savaş döneminde özellikle Türkiye'de darbe yönetimiyle hani demokrasi yerine darbe olmasını tercih ettiler. Biz 12 Eylül sonrasında çok meşhurdur bizde Beyaz Saray'ın kapısını çalıp "Our boys done it" diye bizim çocuklar yaptı darbe mesel gibi anlatılır. Bu anlamda geçmişte böyle bir yanlışı, böyle bir hatalı politikası olmuş mudur Amerikan politikalarının ya da bu konuşuluyor mu?
I regret to say hardly at all. It is not a big issue in the United States what the American role was at various points in the past. I come from a country where scholars sometimes write books about these things and we occasionally debate them, but we are not a country that tends to look very far in the past, and certainly where we tend not to judge our own behavior very critically. One of the virtues, I think, or I suppose, of being as powerful as the United States has been in recent years is we've felt like we could do almost anything we wanted and get away with it. And that's unfortunate. Not only do we not look back on September 12th and whatever our position might have been in Turkey then, but we don't even look back and judge harshly the people who arranged for the United States to invade Iraq in 2003, which has to have been one of the most foolish decisions any American president has ever made. And yet the people who advised him to do that are still respected in the United States, are still influential in the United States. Some of them are advising Mitt Romney as he runs for president. And some of the people who supported it are serving in the Obama administration. And if we can't look back and hold those people accountable, we are not going to hold accountable the people who may or may not have supported a coup d'etat in Turkey many years ago. I would add one other point, however, that the issue of how Turkey deals with its past, and in particular how Turkey deals with it now, is important to some degree in the United States, and I'll explain why. There are people in the United States who are worried about Turkey in part because of the dispute between Turkey and Israel. That's not the only thing they're worried about, but that's part of the motivation, that as relations between Turkey and Israel got worse, groups in the United States that are very supportive of Israel began to worry more and be more critical of Turkey. And one of the issues that they have been concerned about has been the way that the Turkish government is handling Operation Sledgehammer and some of the other accusations that have been made. I don't have an opinion about whether anyone is innocent or guilty, but I do think it is in Turkey's interest, that those issues be resolved as quickly and as openly and as transparently as possible, so that some Americans do not have an excuse to be critical of Turkey for reasons that may or may not be valid. It is very much in Turkey's interest to deal with that as quickly and openly and fairly as possible, so that those who may or may not be guilty are judged fairly and quickly. And I say that as someone who considers himself a friend of Turkey.
Evet, bu son süreçle ilgili olarak değil ama işte geçmişle ilgili olarak 12 Eylül'den başlayarak bir yüzleşme, bir geçmişle hesaplaşma, öz eleştiri döneminin başladığını da söyleyebiliriz. Burada galiba demin Arap dünyasına bir dizi kültürü ihracından söz etmiştik. Herhalde Amerikan dünyasına da Türkiye'nin böyle özellikle Vietnam, Irak bunlardan hep kaçtığını söylediniz. Kendi hatalarıyla da bir yüzleşme açısından bir yüzleşme kültürünün de Türkiye'den belki ihraç edilebileceğini düşünüyoruz. Peki şimdi ben buradaki konuklarımıza söz vermeden önce soruyu saklı tutarak o konuklarımızdan bulunan izleyicilerimizden daha doğrusu gelecek soruları da içine alarak cevaplandırabilirsiniz. Şimdi yeni dünya düzeninde yeni bir liderlik söz konusu olabilir. Bilemiyoruz, geçmişte yaşandığı gibi bu çatışmalı bir dönemden ya da sıcak savaş döneminden geçerek mi yaşanır, daha gergin bir sürece mi sürüklenir dünya bu liderlik meselesinde? Doğrusu bunu sormak durumundayız çünkü biz Türkiye'de biraz bu liderlik meselesinde çatışmasız olmuyor bu işler. Biz futbolda liderliğimiz bile şöyle kavgasız gürültüsüz el değiştirmiyor. Onu söyledikten sonra araya öyle bir şeyle konuşalım kendi güncel olaylarımızdan. Bu liderlik meselesi nasıl yaşanacak dünyada bunu soracağım ama izleyicilerden gelen sorularla belki birleştirerek cevaplandırırız. Hem de vakitten de tasarruf etmiş oluruz. Beyefendi evet sormak istiyorum. Mikrofona. Could you please speak to the microphone, please?
The microphone.
Yeah. Then the audience can understand. Yeah.
أريد أن أعرف في العالم الجديد كيف يمكن أن يطلب
Yeah.
كيف يمكن أن يكون هناك بين الكيان الصهيوني والعالم العربي والربيع العربي أي علاقات؟ العلاقات كانت محاكمة ولم تستشر الشعوب إطلاقا في عقد المعاهدات. رقم واحد. اثنين، هناك 6 مليون فلسطيني خارج أرضهم وجاء إسرائيليون من بلاد شتى ليحتلوا الأرض والقدس. 3، هناك شاليط كان أسيرا واحدا من أجل إقامة الدنيا كلها، وهناك 5000 أسير منهم 3000 أسير جاعوا شهورا 74 يوم بعضهم ولم يحدث شيء. أنا أريد أن أؤكد للسيد ليفي لن يكون هناك سلام شعبي بين الشعوب العربية والربيع العربي وبين الكيان الصهيوني.
I just want to refer first to your comment about the past. I'm very much in favor of countries facing their past with courage. I'm very much in favor of nations facing their past and taking responsibility for the past. But this should include everybody. And the Americans should face their past vis-à-vis the Native Americans. And the Israelis, much more than this, should face their own past and their responsibility for the Nakba, which they don't. So when we come to Turkey and ask Turkey to face its past, we should come to this with clean hands, both Americans and Israelis. And I'm very much in favor. Now, about the Palestinian people under the occupation and the hunger strike of hundreds of Palestinian prisoners, which, thanks God, came to its end. And they achieved, by the way, quite a lot, which again brings me to all kinds of thoughts. Why can't Israel give human conditions to the Palestinian prisoners without a strike? Why should a strike take place of 70 days in order to give minimal conditions, in order that Palestinians from Gaza will be able to get visits from their families after 6 years that they didn't? But the question is much broader. The occupation right now, and this must be said, is in a very relatively comfortable phase. On one hand, life in the West Bank is a little better than 5 years ago. Traffic is a little better. Economy is a little better. And on the other hand, there is a whole Palestinian generation who was smashed in the Second Intifada, part of it killed, injured, jailed. And I think that the Palestinian people needs to wait for the next generation, for the next uprising, because this generation is more or less tired, wounded, bleeding, and it will take some time to create a new generation for the next uprising. In the same time, Israel is not taking advantage of this relatively peaceful, comfortable reality. Because Israel for years said that we will negotiate, we will go for peace, we will go for end of occupation if terror will stop. Terror stopped a long time ago. There is almost no terror. Instead of using this period now, when there is no terror, when the atmosphere can enable some serious steps, Israel again gets to this illusion that, you know, if it's peaceful, why should we bother? And again we are getting to this phase in which Israel is telling the Palestinians, and it's horrible to say it, it's horrible to listen to it, but this is the matter of fact. Israel is telling the Palestinians, if you will not fight, if you will not shoot, if you will not use violence, the world will forget about you and we will forget about you. It's a terrible message, but this is the message. And as long as Israel will not come to terms with itself, first of all, realize that the occupation is illegal, criminal, not moral, and doesn't fit the new world, as long as this will not happen, we will see one cycle after the other, one circle after the other of bloodshed, and then some Israeli concessions, and another bloodshed, another cycle of negotiations and false illusions that we are getting to a solution, because basically, and this must be said, basically Israel does not want to put an end to the occupation. That's the basic truth, and as long as this will not change, nothing will change.
Thank you. Evet, başka soru? Kime sorduğunuzu da söylerseniz.
Katılımcılarımıza ve konuşmacılarımıza soruyorum. Politik alandan ekonomik alana
Tüm
geçelim.
konuşmacılara derseniz 10'ar dakikadan yarım saat gider.
Yok.
Seçin bir tane.
Hocalarımıza
Peki.
soralım. Efendim, ekonomik alana geçiyoruz. Şimdi şunun irdelenmesini istiyorum. 21. yüzyıla geldiğimizde sömürü düzenine dayalı ekonomik yapıyı terk etmiş olan Batı'nın teknoloji ve tüketim üzerine odaklandırdığı ve yaklaşık 40-50 yıldır sürdürmekte olduğu ekonomik yapının bugün de artık terk edilmekte olduğunu, dünya ticaretinin batıdan doğuya doğru değil de artık doğudan doğuya veya doğudan batıya doğru yürümekte olduğunu, gelecek 10 yılda tamamıyla doğudan batıya doğru gidecek olduğunu fark ederek ve varsayarak, acaba bu yeni dünya düzeni bu durumu meşrulaştırmak ve reorganize etmek için mi konuşuluyor, yoksa yeni bir aldatmacayla karşı karşıya mıyız?
Kim cevap vermek ister? Mr. Walt. Mr. Taylor.
I'll take a couple of attempts to answer it. First of all, I do want to say that I agree with everything Gideon Levy said about the importance of countries examining their past. I think, I hope no one thought that my earlier answer suggests that I didn't think the United States should do that. I very much think the United States should look at its past the way all countries should. That's why you need independent scholars, because that's one of our jobs, and that's why you need independent journalists like Gideon, and why you need a very free and open discussion, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, so that countries can evaluate that and can evaluate their own behavior. I would add one other point is I actually believe the Arab Spring will have one very important effect on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that is it will make Arab governments have to pay more attention to this issue, because it is still an issue that Arab peoples care very much about. Some of the previous governments were able to pay relatively little attention to it, and I think that will change over time. Now, with respect to the gentleman's question, I think he is right in at least one sense that the patterns of the world economy are shifting, and they are shifting very much towards the east. And of course, that's reflected in the economic growth that you see happening in India, in China, in Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. So that part of the world is becoming wealthier, it's going to become more influential, and other countries are going to care more about what's happening there. This will also increase the degree to which some Asian countries care about the politics of, say, the Middle East. As China continues to develop, it's going to be interested in its where it's going to get oil itself. It's going to be interested in other raw materials. It's going to be interested in trading relationships, and it will therefore be a more active political player in places like the Middle East than China was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. And finally, you see the United States being aware of these changes as well. You'll remember a few moments ago I said the United States is going to have to make choices. It is not going to be able to act everywhere and be militarily powerful in every part of the world and try to run every single corner of the world as perhaps it once did. I believe that in the future you will see several things happen. The United States will not be militarily engaged in Europe. We will not have troops in Europe in large numbers in the future because there's no need for America to have troops in Europe. The United States is not going to have large numbers of troops in the Middle East in the future, I believe. Once we are completely out of Iraq, we're not going to have a large number of troops. We're going to be focusing over time much more of our strategic effort and attention to East Asia, primarily because we're going to be worried about China, but also because the economic importance of Asia is likely to be growing over time as well. So in that sense, I think the gentleman is completely correct. But one final thing is that oil is not going to stop being a very, very important commodity because it is still the least expensive source of energy in the world, and as long as it's cheap, people are going to want to use it.
Çok teşekkür ederiz. Bir hanımefendi vardı orada.
Thanks for all for the nice talks. I'm really emotional. I'm really sorry for that. I'm not used to talk in an audience like scholars like that. I'm a student at Fatih University, undergraduate Bachelor International Relations, so I'm more impressed to talk in front of professors, which papers I'm normally reading in my courses, so sorry for that. First of all, what I really want to pick out in the Israel case is that, like Mr. Levitt said, it's a truth that even one generation before, the Israeli people were more on the Western values. Those who built the nation of Israel, they were more focused on Western values. The new generation is more nationalist, more religious, and more religious ethnic perspective. That's the problem. Like Mr. Walt picked out in his book about lobbying, Jewish lobby in the U.S. It's a problem that the U.S. interferes into the region every time because it prevents the dialogue. When there is another state which is not from the region and which does not understand the region, that's another problem for me, which I cannot understand. Another problem is, I think, the topic about the conference is about a new world and just global order. What we forget here are the post-colonial states, Africa, Latin American states, or which we see as a new mandatism, which African presidents had, which is forgotten. Another point is that the European Union, an agreement which was based on the German and French conflict, which was based on bringing enemies as friends under an economic cooperation, is collapsing, which will bring problems in the Union because the East enlargement was, from my perspective as a German-Turkish person, wrongdoing. So thanks at all, we are forgetting, I think, like Huntington is saying, West and East. I don't agree about that. Multiculturalism, I think, is the new trend which has to come. Thinking every time about security brings only the need of balancing. So neorealism, I don't know. I think a bit constructivist in that thing. Domestic affects international. Sorry for keeping it so long. Thanks a lot.
Peki. Teşekkür ediyoruz. Sorudan çok görüş olarak aldık. Sayın Taylor ve Sayın Profesör Walt yararlandılar diye umuyorum. Peki. Yok, espri diye söylemiyorum canım, olur mu? Herkes herkesten yararlanır.
I think you passed your examinations.
Could I add something? Just a quick comment. I don't think that the EU is collapsing. I think that the integrative enterprise is being weakened, but it's still a pretty powerful economic group. If I could add a point to the question from the gentleman there,